Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill, a show where we talk about bitter pills of truth that a lot of people don't want to swallow and the corporate media don't want you to know about. And, one bitter pill that's impossible for anybody to avoid confronting, unless they live in a cave, is the fact that we have a global pandemic going on right now. At the moment, over 700,000 people have died from COVID-19. Almost a quarter of them in the good old U.S. I think the last figure I saw was about 163,000. Um, and that makes COVID-19 currently the third leading cause of death in the United States behind heart disease and cancer. So, it really is a big deal. Now, it is true, of course, that younger people who don't have pre-existing conditions don't have a high death rate from COVID. Um, you know, I think roughly half of people who die from COVID are over the age of 60. Um, but you can get sick from it, and you can get really quite ill with it. And studies are finding that a very large number of people who get infected with COVID have long-term damage of some sort, such as heart damage or lung damage, and so forth. Um, and of course, even if you don't get really sick from it, or in fact, don't have any symptoms at all, as a significant percentage of people don't, that doesn't mean that you can't infect somebody else who could get a lot more sick than you are. So it makes sense to take it seriously. It's an extremely contagious disease. So it's important to do whatever we can to protect ourselves and other people. Um, and, although a lot of people are doing quite a bit in that regard here in the U.S., there are also quite a few people who aren't. And as a nation overall, we're not doing nearly enough. There doesn't seem to be any sort of coherent strategy. Many states still don't mandate the wearing of masks in high-risk situations, for example. And there are an awful lot of people, unfortunately, including some of my fellow progressive YouTubers, who aren't taking this virus seriously enough. Excuse me. I promise I don't have COVID. I think it's allergies. Minimize its severity and come up with spurious objections to wearing masks. And that needs to stop. Because, as I said, 163,000 people already have died here in the United States. Projections are from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington that given the trends right now, by December we're going to have nearly 300,000 deaths from COVID, which would continue to make it a third leading cause of death. Now, one of the most important measures that we can take, and the main focus of this video, as you can guess from the title, is that we all need to wear a mask. Not everywhere, obviously, because if we're not around other people, we can't infect other people. Excuse me. But certainly in a situation where you're at high risk of being infected with COVID-19 or other serious diseases, you should wear a mask. So today I'm going to talk about what those situations are, how we can try to avoid them, and what the evidence is that masks are helpful. Now, obviously masks are not a panacea. They can't stop 100% of the viruses you come into contact with, especially if you're not wearing an N95 mask where it's fitted and very, very filtering, so not much gets through. And the virus can also potentially infect you through your eyes, so masks can't help you with that. Healthcare workers or others who are exposed to a very high level of the virus wear other protective gear, such as goggles and hazmat suits and so forth, in addition to N95 masks. But obviously, wearing masks is just one measure. They aren't a substitute for other measures, such as keeping your distance from other people that we need to take to try and minimize our exposure to infected people, or minimize other people's exposure to us. We may not necessarily know that we're infected. And there are measures that governments and businesses need to take to minimize the public's risk, but often that hasn't been the case over the last few months, as we've seen, at least not to a sufficient extent. But there's extensive evidence that wearing masks, where appropriate, is one of several measures that's very helpful. So I'm going to focus on the reasons and evidence why masks are helpful in this video. So to understand that, we need to understand how the virus is generally transmitted. Now, you can potentially get it from touching infected surfaces and then touching your face and so forth. But that doesn't appear to be the main route of transmission. Since it is a potential route of transmission, that's the reason why it's recommended that you wash your hands. If you've been touching surfaces that could potentially be contaminated. But the main route of transmission is airborne transmission of droplets, which are virus-containing liquid, officially defined as sizes larger than 5 micrometers in diameter. Those are typically emitted when an infected person coughs or sneezes, and to a lesser extent when they speak, or even when they just breathe. And there are also what are called droplet nuclei, which are much smaller globs of virus-containing liquid, smaller than 5 micrometers in diameter, often much smaller. And because they're so small, they can stay in the air longer and travel greater distances. Droplets typically fall to the ground after about 1 meter. If, for example, a person coughs them out. Given that this is a route of transmission, you hear talk of, the masks are not fine grained enough to block out viruses. Viruses can get through it because they're so small. Yeah, of course, but viruses don't float around in the air by themselves. They're contained in little water or water vapor droplets. And masks can stop those, or the majority of them. Both coming and going. So masks reduce the ability of droplets or droplet nuclei to travel in or out of the mask, reducing the amount of viral exposure both for the mask wearer and for those in the vicinity of an infected mask wearer. And that means that not only is the likelihood of getting the disease caused by the virus lower, but also potentially the severity of the illness that you get if you do get enough of the virus that it overwhelms your immune system and you get infected. The severity tends to be reduced if you're wearing a mask, some evidence suggests, because there's this concept of viral load, the amount of virus that you're exposed to. The more viral load you get, the more likely the virus is to kind of defeat your immune system and make you sick. And the more viral load you get, the sicker you're likely to be. So the amount of viral exposure, of course, depends not only on whether you're wearing a mask, but also on the distance you are from other people, because virus containing droplets or droplet nuclei can only travel so far. And typically, you need to be, it's argued, at least 1 meter, but preferably more, up to 6 feet or more away from other people. It's also related to the amount of time that you spend in their proximity. So if, for example, you're out jogging and you jog past somebody who's jogging the other way, you're not in each other's vicinity for very long at all. So you're not going to get exposed to very much unless they just cough directly in your face. And also whether the exposure occurs indoors or outdoors. And I'll discuss all this later. But I just wanted to show you here a cool little visual illustration of the effectiveness of masks.
Tips with Uncle Rob. Today we're going to figure out definitively if these masks work or not. First we have to figure out how far a cough or a sneeze goes. That's about 8 feet. Now we need to see if any of the spray cans I have in my garage spray about 8 feet, or about the same as my cough spit. That's a spray paint can. This is isopropyl alcohol. I think that one's a little short. Ether. And I think that one goes about as far as my sneeze, cough, spit. Next step, I've cut out holes in a mannequin head that will fit this starter fluid spray. And I'll put a spray paint handle on it so I can use it like a coronavirus gun to shoot through the mask. Next step, we're going to strap a propane torch to a stake, and then put the propane torch next to the mannequin's face and light it so that we can test whether masks work or not. Alright, so now we're going to test 8 feet mask on.
Hold it.
Cough, cough, cough. Now 8 feet mask off. Cough, cough, cough. 6 feet mask on. Cough, cough, cough. 6 feet mask off. Cough, cough, cough. 4 feet mask on. Cough, cough, cough. 4 feet mask off. Cough, cough. 2 feet mask on. Cough, cough, cough. 2 feet mask off. Cough, cough. 1 foot mask on. Cough, cough, cough. I can't believe that didn't fail. 6 inches mask on. Cough, cough, cough. 3 inches mask on. Cough, cough, cough. Okay, so this is now 3 inches with no mask. Cough, cough, cough. Don't be a wear a mask, not a condom. So I've proven definitively whether masks work or not. Make your own decision. But I think I'm going to wear one to protect people like him. And I'll see you in another couple years. This is the man that helped me film the video. This is why we should wear masks, to protect people like this, because they are more susceptible than we are. So quit being a and put on a mask.
I'm a senior with Alzheimer's. I protest. I'm going to complain to AARP. I'm here under protest. It's senior citizens bullying.
Okay, that was cute. All right, where were we? So, pretty graphic visual illustration of how effective masks can be at stopping spewing of liquid from reaching a person that you're coughing in the direction of. But let's talk about some of the scientific research on masks. There's an abundance of evidence of lower transmission rates of influenza and various coronavirus-caused illnesses, such as colds or other viruses in that family, including COVID, which is SARS coronavirus 2, 2019. If masks are worn, and even if they're only cloth masks rather than surgical masks, they're the most effective type of mask, N95 respirators. There is evidence that they are effective. So let's see. From this article titled "A Rapid Systematic Review of the Efficacy of Face Masks and Respirators Against Coronaviruses and Other Respiratory Transmissible Viruses for a variety of groups of people." This was published in the International Journal of Nursing Studies, peer-reviewed journal. And so what they say is that the evidence suggests protection by masks in high transmission settings, such as household and college settings, especially if used early in some trials, if combined with hand hygiene and if wearers are compliant. If masks protect in high transmission settings, they should also protect in crowded public spaces, such as workplaces, public transit, etc. The trial, which did not show efficacy, used influenza as the outcome measure, which is a rare outcome, and it had a small sample size. And there are other studies that have found that flu transmission is cut by masks as well. Well, let's see. Another article, physical distancing, face masks, and eye protection to prevent person-to-person transmission of SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. Review and meta-analysis. Meta-analyses are studies that do statistical analyses of a whole group of studies together, so they can they have more power to find effects. So what they found in this meta-analysis of 172 observational studies and 44 comparative studies, controlled studies in various settings, they found that transmission of viruses was lower with physical distancing of 1 meter or more, and that if you got farther than that, protection did increase. And also face mask use could result in a large reduction in risk of infection. More so within N95 respirators, but not a huge difference. And eye protection also is associated with less infection. So if you're a healthcare worker or other person who's in a very high risk situation, you'd be well advised to wear goggles as well as a face mask. Anyway. Our findings are, to the best of our knowledge, the first to rapidly synthesize all direct information on COVID-19 and therefore, as well as SARS and MERS, which are less infectious than COVID-19 but far deadlier. And therefore, they provide the best available evidence to inform optimum use of three common and simple interventions to help reduce the rate of infection. Okay, well, I was just kind of repeating what we said already. Let's see. Another study. Research gaps exist regarding the efficacy of face masks, with some scientific reviews cautioning that more research on masks is needed in order to better understand the efficacy of different types of masks in different contexts. So what they're saying is that sometimes it's not clear, perhaps because of insufficient sample size, how much of a difference there is between the efficacy of different types of masks. But the evidence that has emerged so far suggests that masks are beneficial for reducing the transmission of respiratory diseases like COVID-19. So an April 2020 study published in, where did I go here? Nature Medicine examined the shedding of various respiratory viruses, including seasonal coronaviruses and influenza, by more than 100 infected individuals, as well as the efficacy of face masks in reducing the dissemination of infectious droplets. The authors found that surgical masks reduce the direct detection of coronavirus and viral copies in large respiratory droplets and in aerosols, suggesting that masks can reduce viral transmission. Another review published in the International Journal of Nursing Studies looked at 19 randomized controlled trials, in other words, random assignment of participants to mask or no mask conditions, obviously not with a disease like COVID-19 because it's too risky, that wouldn't be ethical. But anyway, the review concluded that in the community, masks appear to be effective with and without hygiene, and both together are more protective. A May 2020 study published in BMJ Global Health measured the incidence of secondary COVID-19 transmissions in 124 families in Beijing, China. Each family had one member with a confirmed COVID-19 infection, and basically they found that using disinfectants, physical distancing, and face masks reduce the risk of or reduce the likelihood of other people in the household being infected. A review and meta-analysis by Chu et al. Published in Lancet looked at physical distancing, face masks, and eye protection, and found that face masks reduce the risk of coronavirus infection compared to no mask wearing, and that N95 respirators might be associated with a larger reduction in risk compared with surgical or similar masks. It's important to remember, though, they say that masks do not provide complete protection from infection. People must still continue to practice physical distancing of about 2 meters, 6 feet or more, and good hand hygiene. Let's see. In this article from University of California, San Francisco, summarized some data. One study looked at coronavirus deaths across 198 countries and found that those with cultural norms or government policies favoring mask wearing had lower death rates. So, for example, countries like China, New Zealand, Japan, there's several countries where mask wearing, either for cultural reasons or because it's required, or is extremely high. A friend and business partner lives in Hong Kong, and he says the only people who don't wear masks in Hong Kong are Americans. Everybody else does. And they have lower death rates and infection rates. Two compelling case reports also suggest that masks can prevent transmission in high-risk scenarios. In one case, a man who was infected flew from China to Toronto, subsequently tested positive for COVID. He had a dry cough, wore a mask on the flight, and all 25 people closest to him on the flight tested negative for COVID-19. Another study that came out in May found that 2 hairstylists in Missouri who were infected had close contact with 140 clients while they were sick, but evidently didn't know it. Everyone wore a mask both the hairstylists and their clients, and none of the clients tested positive. So that's quite a contrast to situations like that cruise ship, Princess Diamond, I think it was, or Diamond Princess, that had, I think it was about half of the passengers and crew getting infected with COVID because this was very early on and not much was known at the time, so nobody was wearing masks. Now, one common objection to evidence of this sort by mask skeptics is the claim that since the data are correlational rather than from a controlled experiment, we can't assume there's a cause and effect relationship between wearing masks and lower infection rates. Now, it's true that we can't randomly assign people to wear masks or not and make sure they go places where they're likely to be exposed to COVID. That would just be too risky because it's very infectious. And even if you're not high risk, you don't really know for sure if you're high risk, but you can infect somebody else who is. So we can't do that. But in fact, we do have experimental evidence about mask wearing and transmission of many different viruses, including animal studies with COVID-19, actually. So let's take a look at some of that. Let's see. I think I've already looked at that. Okay. Oh, here we go. So earlier this year, a team of researchers in China tried to compare infection rates in hamsters that they weren't wearing masks, but they had a barrier made out of mask material between themselves and COVID-infected fellow hamsters, and they were highly unlikely to get infected. If they did get infected, they got less sick on average than animals that didn't have a barrier between them and their infected fellow hamsters. So, controlled experiment there. Mass material barrier versus no mass material barrier. And the hamsters that did have a mass material barrier between themselves and infected hamsters were unlikely to get infected, and if they did, they didn't get sick. Significant differences with the control group where there wasn't a barrier between themselves and infected hamsters. In addition, we have some sort of natural experiments that demonstrate efficacy. We have, for example, a study that looked at data from New York and Lombardy province in Italy, where the various measures taken to combat COVID-19 were not necessarily taken at the same time. So both in Lombardy province in Italy and in New York City, mask mandates were implemented much later than other measures such as mass testing and quarantines and lockdowns and social distancing guidelines. So, for example, in New York, they implemented the latter in late March, and it wasn't until April 17th that they mandated that people wear masks in public spaces where you couldn't keep your social distance. And in both cases, they found that the other measures limited the growth of new cases, but were not by themselves totally flattening the curve. But once they implemented the mask mandates, the rate of new cases dramatically declined. So, since that's the only major policy change that took place at the time, implementing a mask mandate, we can pretty compellingly rule out alternative explanations for that rapid decline in development of new cases and decline in deaths. We also have data from workplaces and cruise ships on this. So on the Diamond Princess, ultimately about 20% of the people who were infected were asymptomatic. Whereas overall, since we now have a situation in the world where a lot more people wear a mask, whereas nobody was wearing masks on the Diamond Princess, about 40%, it's estimated tentatively, because we don't have really strong measures taken to get representative samples as far as the number of people who are positive. But researchers have tentatively estimated that about 40% of coronavirus infections don't produce any symptoms. But the more people wear masks, the more asymptomatic cases there are. So during an outbreak at a seafood processing plant in Oregon, 90% of people who were infected at this plant were asymptomatic, and they were universally wearing masks. There was another cruise ship from Argentina where all passengers were issued surgical masks after someone on board came down with a fever. And more than 80% of the cases were asymptomatic. So in short, although there's other possible reasons why we've had some decline in death rates despite the skyrocketing, unfortunately, of cases here in the United States, it could just be that more people are getting tested in part, but since rates of hospitalization have gone up since the significant increase in new cases over the last couple of months, it's likely that there are a lot more new real infections. But as I talked about in the last video I did on this, it's infecting younger people who are less susceptible to really severe illness. But it's argued, based on data that I've just presented to you, that a major reason why fewer people are dying is that more people are wearing masks. However, not enough people are wearing masks. I think I read figures on the order of about 2/3 of people nationwide are wearing masks when they're in public situations where they can't maintain physical distancing. So it needs to be higher than that. But in general, the evidence strongly supports wearing masks as a way to minimize risk of infection and severity of symptoms, both by reducing the amount of virus that escapes from an infected person's nose and mouth when they cough or sneeze or yell or what have you, and also reducing or eliminating viral exposure for a non-infected mask wearer. So it works in both directions. Of course, there are lots of other factors, as I've discussed, that are associated with exposure to the virus. Obviously, the ideal situation as far as your risk of the virus would be to stay in your house or apartment if you can isolate from the airstream of other people in your apartment. Just not go out, get everything delivered to you that you need. And then your chances of getting infected are basically zero. But a lot of people have to go to work in situations where they're around other people, and they may have other reasons why they need to come into close proximity to other people. So, in addition to wearing masks, washing our hands frequently, and maintaining at least 6 feet of distance from other people. I already talked about evidence that those measures make a difference. And also, the risk, it turns out, is a lot lower if you're outdoors than if you're indoors. I don't have the study called up where I saw data on this, but the research suggests there's something like on average, ballpark, about 20 times lower risk of infection outdoors versus indoors. And the reason for that is that the virus can go anywhere if you're outdoors. It's not confined in a small space. So it's dispersed, and you're not going to be exposed to as much of it typically. And also, of course, the fact that people were outdoors, plus the vast majority of them were wearing masks, is that's the reason why we didn't see big outbreaks of new infections during the recent wave of protests about police brutality. If the protests had taken place indoors and people were not wearing masks, then it would have been quite a different story, I'm sure. So, I'm fortunate enough to be able to work from home myself, so I don't have to worry about exposure in the workplace. And the local gym on campus is closed right now, so I can't go to the gym and play racquetball like I often do otherwise. So I go for runs these days for exercise, and that's pretty ideal because it's outdoors, and you don't encounter that many people, and if you do encounter them, you just go by each other pretty fast, especially if you're on a bike or whatever. But I do carry a mask with me when I go out running, and I will usually, if I can't maintain 6 feet distance from people, as is the case if there's kind of a narrower path, then I'll put on a mask as I'm going by them. But it's a fairly low risk situation, and health professionals do recommend that people wear a mask when exercising, on those occasions where they come into close proximity with others. But even if you're not wearing a mask, outdoors in situations where you're not near other people either at all, or if you are, it's for a very, very brief period of time, that's a pretty low risk situation. Unfortunately, here in freedom-loving America, we have a lot of folks who yell and scream about their freedom, so to speak, to not wear a mask if they don't feel like it. Sometimes in very close proximity to other people, they'll just kind of scream in their face. But a fellow I know on Twitter from the Tulsi Gabbard campaign, because he was a supporter of Tulsi Gabbard, as was I, Brad Polumbo, is a columnist for the Washington Examiner. So he's kind of conservative, libertarian sort of person. So there's quite a few issues that I don't agree with him. But even somebody like him, who's he's certainly the last person in the world who would be unconcerned about civil liberties, says, get over it, wear a damn mask. And it says, libertarian and conservative critics who say no to mask mandates incite freedom miss the mark. Despite the controversy over these rules, when localized mask mandates allow for municipal authorities, depending on the needs of their communities, to limit the spread of the virus through the proper exercise of governmental authority. And he goes through a number of right-wingers' arguments about, don't make me wear a mask, you're violating my freedom. So, for example, the group Turning Point USA's head, Charlie Kirk, said, do not force me to wear a mask. I'm not going to do it. It's that simple. We have a huge civil liberty issue here. Why do you have the authority to tell me what I can and cannot do with my body? So, as Patrick Henry once said, give me liberty or give me death. Well, he was given the liberty to not wear a mask, and COVID gave him the death part. So he got liberty and death rather than liberty or death. While mandating that citizens wear masks does involve some degree of forced discomfort, it's a pain in the ass, especially if you work and you have to wear one, all day long to wear a mask. It's not just an issue of individual liberty. And the reason, he points out, is wearing a mask is not a matter of protecting yourself from COVID-19. He says that's not what masks do, but as we've discussed, it does protect you. But the reason why the liberty argument doesn't fly here is that masks limit the wearer's spread of droplets that infect others. So it's the reason why you're not at liberty to do that is the same reason you're not at liberty to get in a car and drive drunk. Mandating masks is about limiting your ability to infect other people in public without their consent. So in this sense, mask bans, he says, are similar to laws banning drunk driving. Sure, such laws technically infringe, quote unquote, on your liberty to drive drunk, but that limitation is justified because the action in question endangers others. Critics who cite individual freedom as cause to oppose mask mandates are on weak ground. The government exists to to prohibit people from violating the rights of others. Well, that's certainly one reason governments exist. Arguing it should not do so isn't liberty, it's anarchy. And he goes on to describe, a lot of the same evidence that I have regarding the efficacy of masks. So, for example, a recent study published in Health Affairs compared the COVID-19 growth rate before and after mask mandates in 15 states in the District of Columbia. It found that mask mandates led to a significant slowdown in daily COVID-19 growth. Of new cases, which became more apparent over time. So initially, during the first 5 days after a mandate, the daily growth rate of new cases slowed by 0.9 percentage points compared to 5 days prior to the mandate. At 3 weeks, the daily growth rate had slowed by 2 percentage points. And he mentions this study I did earlier about many different countries looking at whether they had mask mandates or cultural norms favoring mask wearing, and the ones that did had much lower death rates. And there have been a number of people who've been loud opponents of mask wearing, such as, for example, former Republican presidential candidate Herman Cain, who, after he ran his mouth about how it was restricting our freedom to try to make people wear masks, he went maskless at a public event, a Trump rally, caught COVID, and died from it. But in any case, I think Brad, even though he's pretty conservative, so there are lots of issues I disagree with him, I think he makes a very clear and compelling argument here for why mask mandates are not a meaningful violation of civil liberties. They're simply a government measure trying to protect other people from us, if we're infected and don't know it. And this shouldn't be a political issue. Really, it isn't a political issue, but some people choose to make it one. And We got to stop doing this. It's a public health issue. Countries where mask wearing has been near universal have vastly lower infection rates than the United States. In some cases, for example, New Zealand, through that and other effective measures, they basically eliminated the virus, and their life is pretty much back to normal. Wouldn't it be nice if we were at that point right now, where we didn't have to worry about getting infected, and we could just go about our business? Workplaces and schools and so forth could all be opened back up. We wouldn't have to worry about that. If we had fucking done what countries like New Zealand did, we wouldn't be in this mess that we're in now. And our economy would be a lot better off. Life would just be better. So why don't we try to get to that point? That's all for this episode of The Bitter Pill. Please like and share this video, comment below, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I will see you next time.